Introduce Jim Wilson, who was one of the few people to hold 3 doctorate degrees and 2 master's degrees, all from different disciplines. He received his PhD in human nutrition from the University of Arizona with a dissertation in cellular immunology, and holds degrees as a doctor of chiropractic and naturopathic medicine. His master's degrees are in bionutrition and experimental psychology, all in all totaling 24 years of post-secondary education. He was one of the 14 founders of the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine in Toronto, one of the largest naturopathic colleges in the world. And he currently resides in Tucson, Arizona. During his 28 years of private practice, he dedicated himself to helping people regain their health and vitality, and continues to pursue that purpose on a wider scale through his current activities of teaching, writing, research, and formulation. He's lectured extensively to physicians and acknowledged as an expert in alternative medicine. He's spoken at some of the most prestigious conferences, the A4M, the ACAM, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, and Brazilian Association of Anti-Aging. Last year he was invited to speak at the Royal Society of Medicine in London. And he has a company called Future Formulations that I think when you get his card you can look up and find lots of products for things like adrenal fatigue, which is the book he wrote a few years ago. It's in his 13th printing, and he didn't bring any more copies this time, so you'll have to order it from the web. I now give you Jim Wilson.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be back again. This is one of the few public presentations I make. Most of the time I speak to physicians and compounding pharmacists, nurses, but I like this group. I have to say, I was just thinking at the break that I think the liveliness in this group is far superior to most physicians I lecture to. It just suddenly hit me how stressed physicians are. Of course, we know that's true, but it was just kind of impactful. Well, the last time I was here, if any of you were here, you remember my computer died on the way to the operation was successful, but the computer died, and so I had to lecture without notes up here for 2 hours, drawing on the board, and you had to try to read my writing. So hopefully you won't have to do that again. Last time I talked about, what did we talk about? Chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia and the relationship of adrenal fatigue with that. And the time before that, I talked strictly about adrenal fatigue, so I thought you might be kind of tired of hearing about that, so I thought I'd tell you about another part of the adrenals, and that's the high-functioning part of the adrenals that we'll see that plays itself out in a condition called metabolic syndrome. So I'm going to concentrate mostly on metabolic syndrome tonight, and if you come up and see me afterwards, you might see that I've got a scratch. It is skin off my nose, and it happened when I was trying to get a piece of stucco off a building, and the whole piece of stucco came off and got me on the nose. So it's literal this time. You know the saying, "Don't skin off my nose"? We're going to talk everybody finds the things in life, certain things in life, interesting, and you can find experts in almost every field. We have a number of experts in the room here tonight, and so once again, it's a pleasure and honor to speak here. But one of the things that interests me is how the body works and the wonderful mechanism that we have inside, and the fact that even in the most sick person, most of the mechanisms are still operating pretty well, and even sick people. So every day, if you wake up and find yourself still breathing, you should thank whatever power it is that you have this. You've been summoned, influenced by this huge evolution that's allowed you to have this mechanism in the body, and you should be very careful about the society we've created because it's trying to tear it down very rapidly. So if you're doing what all your friends are doing, unless they're a special group of friends, you need to change what you're doing if you're going to live to be an older, healthier person. You know, the average person consumes, we were talking about sugar a while ago, the average person consumes 180 pounds of sugar a year. Yeah. Half a pound a day. I had a patient argue with me for 15 minutes that Jell-O has no sugar in it. They're totally clueless. They have no idea. You know, they think a balanced diet is Twinkies and a Coke. So, you know, we've got our work cut out for us, and an enlightened group like this please go out and do what you can to apostolize and convince people, because we don't have a healthcare system that can stand the kind of illnesses that we have. So if they think they're going to throw $1 trillion at it, that's laughable. It's laughable because the baby boomers haven't begun to degenerate yet. And wait until they get into degeneration. And how much money was in the last health plan for prevention? $0. Not a single dollar for prevention. And it's the only way we're going to do it, folks. The only way we're going to do it. Nice that we're going to talk about how you can do this with metabolic syndrome. How you can prevent yourself. So, I don't know whether you realize it or not, but there's probably someone in this room that may be under a little bit of stress. You know, and the interesting thing is people aren't always aware of it. It's a couple studies studying hospital ER physicians shows that people who are ER physicians aren't aware of their stress. When they gave them a paper and pencil test asking them if they thought they were under stress, they said no. But when we looked at their cortisol levels, one of the major indicators of stress, it was 3 times normal. So you don't have to be aware of your stress to be under stress. And stress, even though it can invigorate life, stress when it goes on for a long time or is too intense, or there's too many of them, starts tearing your body down, starts tearing your life down, starts tearing the pleasure that you have down. And the problem is everybody seems to be talking about it. There's thousands and thousands of articles about stress on the internet. They seem to be worried about it. A lot of people are writing about it, but no one's doing anything about it. Now, it takes about 10,000 years. You know, genetics is big right now. So you wonder, where is that stress gene? Well, it takes about 10,000 years for the body to adapt and develop a new SNP for adaptation to the environment. So we have about 9,900 years to go. And so I'm going to be pretty tired by that time. So I'd rather find something else that may be helping reverse this. And remember that even if they find a genetic strain or this particular gene, usually genes have to be triggered, and they're usually 15 to 30% environmental. I mean, only 15 to 30% of it is the gene. The other 85 to 70% is environmental that triggers that gene to manifest in the first place. So what I'm saying is, before we get to the end, the take-home message in this is there's a tremendous amount you're going to be able to do for your own body, your friends, your loved ones, that doesn't cost a lot of money, that doesn't require drugs, that you can do with your own intelligence, with very little effort, that can reverse this and increase the quality of your life and make yourself a lot happier and healthier. So the purpose of this presentation is to give a practical approach to the successful diagnosis and treatment yourself. You can diagnose and treat yourself. You don't have to be licensed to diagnose and treat yourself. I don't know whether you realize it now. You have to be diagnosed and you have to be licensed to diagnose and treat somebody else, but you don't have to be licensed to diagnose and treat yourself. And we're going to be talking about,
just figured that out yourself.
There we go. You thought I was just talking. Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, this was all supposed to be have slides in it, and then they were.
Should we kill one more set of lights?
Yes, it'd be nice.
So there's projectors and stuff, right?
Like the movies. Popcorn.
Yeah, the back set and then the middle row. Can we see?
Unfortunately, it's this one, that one, and the third one.
Is it okay for you? I was hoping it'd be a little darker so I could pick my nose.
By the way, I'm going over to the dark side now.
Okay. So, the purpose of this is to try to help you see an integration between the high and the low functioning of cortisol, how the adrenals, when they're overworked, can produce a situation called metabolic syndrome. When they're overstressed and they start breaking down, then they start producing something called adrenal fatigue, and I call them the two faces of stress. And they both have greatly to do with the dysfunction of the adrenal glands. So it's a little bit like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't if you have a lot of stress, because if your body can hold up to it and your adrenals are able to function like that, eventually it'll produce metabolic syndrome. And if they break down, then you get adrenal fatigue. So the idea is to minimize your stress or to do things that help your body be more able to cope with stress. Now, the stress is always mediated by what we call the HPA axis, and that's the adrenal hypothalamus pituitary axis. And here's a quote. The HPA axis is the major endocrine stress axis of the human organism. Cortisol, the final hormone of this axis, affects metabolic, cardiovascular, central nervous system, both acutely and chronically. In other words, cortisol is a pretty important factor in how the HPA works. And the HPA axis is pretty important in how you work. And when the HPA axis gets off balance, lots and lots of mechanisms go haywire in your body. Here's a little picture of the HPA axis. And you can see we have the hypothalamus. It looks kind of like a football up there. And it's actually not as large as the adrenal glands, but it's very important. The hypothalamus has to register all the stresses going on in your body. And when I was in experimental psychology, we used to have a phrase, the hypothalamus rules the world. And what do we mean by that? Well, we meant that the hypothalamus controls so many mechanisms. It's about the size of the end of your little finger. It sits in the middle of your brain. And it's called hypothalamus because it sits below the thalamus. And it's a little tiny little thing, but it has to do so many functions. If you did rat experiments, as I did, if you put an electrode in a certain part of the hypothalamus, the rat never ate. If you put it in a slightly different part, the rat never quit eating. If you put it in another part, they never slept. If you put it in another part, they slept all the time. If you put it in another part, they had constant sex drives. If you put it a little bit further, they had no sex drive whatsoever. So the hypothalamus does a tremendous amount of things, and that's why it was called the hypothalamus rules the world. They had that phrase. So one of the things the hypothalamus does is register all the stresses going on in your body, outside your body, in the environment, in your thought processes, and it has to integrate this whole thing and determine how much of a particular hormone called corticotrophic releasing factor, CRF, goes to this other gland called the pituitary gland that hangs like the base, like a little pea hanging from your brain, down the bottom of your brain, and this little piece of bone called the sella turcica. So it goes around like this, and thank goodness it's filled with fluid. And so it hangs down there, and it creates a lot of hormones, and it's divided into a front and back part, and the front part secretes something called adrenal corticotrophic hormone, ACTH. And that goes all the way down, so we have these two things in the brain, that goes all the way down to the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands sit right over here, and they sit over the kidneys, adrenal, over the kidneys. And I say that because I had a doctor about 3 years ago pull on my shirt sleeve of my suit and look down. I was on a platform, and he said, well, it's a pretty good talk, but you had one mistake. And I said, what was that? He said, well, the adrenals are located in the base of the brain. He and I read different anatomy texts. But anyway, I just want you to know, here's how to find the adrenal glands. You take your hands on yourself or someone else, put them behind, find your spine, your lowest ribs. There's my lowest rib. And then where my second and third finger goes, that's about where the adrenal glands are. And if you're quite stressed, that might be a tender area, because it's one of the signs called the Rouleau's sign that we use when someone's has a lot of adrenal fatigue, that we can push on the adrenal glands, and because the adrenal glands have become hypertrophied during that time, they will cause the rest of the that area around there to become tender. It's called a viscochromatic reflex. So it goes down, the cortisol, then after secreted by the adrenal gland. We're talking about the outside of the adrenal gland now, because a different hormone called epinephrine, norepinephrine, or adrenaline, noradrenaline, is secreted from the inside of it. And this goes on the inside, it goes all over the place, but the one on the outside goes to even more places, and cortisol is one of the major hormones. There's about 50 hormones secreted by this little gland that's about as big as a large grape that sits over your kidneys. Over 50 hormones if you count the metabolic intermediates. And so it secretes things like cortisol. We're going to talk about aldosterone that helps control the fluid balances and the sodium retention and potassium-sodium ratios in your body. About 40% of sex hormones are produced, both male and female, by these adrenal glands. As a matter of fact, about 40% of female hormones are produced in normal menstruating women. As women get into menopause, most of the progesterone and estrogen is produced by the adrenal glands. And in men, about 40% of testosterone is produced by the adrenal gland, and as men get into andropause, then we see a more and more predominant role of the adrenals to produce testosterone. So they're very, very important in their function. And so cortisol, one of the major hormones, then goes back up to the hypothalamus, and it tells the hypothalamus, I have enough or I don't have enough. So the hypothalamus then has to determine how much cortisol is in circulation, how much is going to be needed in the next 3 to 6 seconds, because it has about a 3 to 6 second cycle, and tell the pituitary how much ACTH to send down to the adrenals, and that is in the cycle. Now, there's another factor. It's what you are thinking about is also important too. So, let's just say we all have the same amount of stress in here, and the people going out this door think Ed McMahon, who's just recently passed away, was going to give them a publisher clearinghouse check for $1 million. And we have over here an ex-spouse is just about to sue you for divorce papers. Or you think. You see how much different your cortisol levels are going to be? And your hypothalamus is going to anticipate what's going to happen as you go out that door. And so it's going to adjust your cortisol levels, not just on the events that are going on, but what you think is going to happen. And so the hypothalamus ends up being extremely important in this role, and it is important in the mitigation and the adaptation for stress, along with the hippocampus, the amygdala, and other parts of the brain. Now here's a picture of the adrenal glands, and this is not a male and female adrenal gland, that's a right and left adrenal gland. And they have to be different because you have different anatomical structures pressing in on them to give them that. Now, the difficulty is that when doctors do cortisol levels, they base it on a statistical model, not a physiological model. And the reason this is a problem, so I get my pointer to work here. Does it carry over? Good. Okay. So you're considered to be normal if you go into a hospital and they have a cortisol test because you think you're under stress and you want to test your cortisol levels. If you're plus or minus 2 standard deviations, it just disappeared, there we go, which is this gray area through here, then you're considered to be normal. So plus or minus 2 standard deviations ends up being 95%. So by definition, only 2.5% can be low and only 2.5% can be high. That sounds okay, except here's the problem. You start having symptoms of adrenal dysfunction after you get about 15 to 20%. So in other words, about half a standard deviation out, about half here and about half here. After there is when you start getting signs and symptoms on this side of adrenal fatigue. And over here, signs and symptoms of metabolic syndrome, until it becomes very, very overblown and you get Cushing's disease on this side, and over here, Addison's disease on this side. When does medicine recognize the dysfunction for the adrenals? Right here at this line, and right here at this line. So if you're just inside that line, you're normal. If you're over here, that's a hospital crisis. If you're over here, you're normal. If you're right up here, we really have to act fast because you have Cushing's syndrome. So you can see this is an artificial, and it doesn't go along with the physiology at all. Lots of things affect the adrenal gland, things that you don't think of, things you do think of. And so what I'm trying to say in this cartoon is the adrenal glands have to do a lot to help you stay balanced and to feel good. And they're mainly called the glands of stress because they mainly handle stress, even though they have a lot to do with sex hormone production and other things. But its main job is to handle stress for you. Now, Dr. Selye showed in his early experiments, and he wrote over 100 books. He had hundreds of articles, very prolific writer out of Montreal. And he showed that when an animal is first exposed to a severe stress, he did things like he broke their legs and burned them and did surgery without sewing them back up and all kinds of other things like that. He could never get away. It took me 2 years to get an animal subjects committee to let me inject the foot pad of an anesthetized rat. I mean, there's no way in the world I'd be able to do, or anybody would be able to do any of Dr. Selye's experiments today. But what he did show is that animals have a predictable way of responding to stress, and it emulates a lot of what we go through when we have stress. And that's it. When we first are exposed to stress, we get a big rise in the adrenal gland function, including a rise in cortisol. And then you can see that the main line is the baseline of cortisol. And then you get a big rise, and then the adrenal gland gives it all, and then it has to recover for a while. But if that stress continues, the adrenal gland recovers and moves up, and then it gets above baseline, and that's called the stage of resistance, and we can go like that. Animals go for several months. We could go for several years like that at a price, but we can function. It depends on the person, too. Some people, one more stress, that's it. Other people can go like this for a long time. We have a society that is driving itself, and most of the people in it, or a lot of the people in it, have high cortisol levels if their adrenals are able to function well. But then an interesting thing happens on a lot of these people. You get a more severe stress or something else happens, and the adrenals seem to suddenly give out, and that person then a lot of times goes into what we know as adrenal fatigue. This is a little cartoon that shows you that in addition to cortisol, there's another important hormone called aldosterone. And aldosterone controls the potassium-sodium balance in the body, in the blood, and the interstitial fluid between the cells, and also within the cells. And as stress goes on, aldosterone becomes even more important because the ratio of sodium-potassium in your body has a lot to do with how well you handle the stress. So there's a tenet in physiology. If you want to know what happens to the water in the body, follow the sodium, because water follows sodium. So when someone's under stress and the adrenals are able to respond, and they respond by increasing aldosterone as well as cortisol, then your body retains fluid. It retains the sodium and pees out the potassium, so it tends to then retain the fluid as well. So this is one of the biggest reasons why Gatorade works so well, because it's very high in potassium, and it helps replace the potassium of the athlete who gets the cortisol levels like crazy during the athletic event, preserving that sodium, excreting the potassium, and then the potassium from the Gatorade or something else comes in to balance his system and make it more balanced. When you have adrenal fatigue, you have the opposite problem. You pee out the sodium and you retain the potassium, so those people then need sodium. So those people need salt. On the metabolic syndrome side, with the high cortisol levels and the high adrenal function, salt is very bad for them. It's the worst thing they can do. So you don't want salt on that side. Over here, you can't function very well without the salt. So how do you know? Usually, you'll have a desire for salt, because your body naturally, if you haven't suppressed its natural desire, it will want that salt. But we're in a salt-phobic society, aren't we? So you ask people if they salt their food, they say, I never salt. You know, they expect it to come with a badge on it for no salt. You say, well, do you like salted popcorn? Oh yeah. Well, what about pretzels? I eat a lot of pretzels. So it's funny how they won't salt their food, but they'll eat salty foods to try to get this. If they have adrenal fatigue or low functioning adrenals, that's how they get that back in to help balance, to help get this aldosterone, to give this aldosterone more of a break. So once again, we have this side, and then we have the other side. So basically, when the body's under continual stress, if the adrenals can remain strong, then eventually you get into metabolic syndrome. If the adrenals collapse or become weaker under this time, then you develop adrenal fatigue. So the key is we need to strengthen the adrenal glands, keep them strong, and decrease the stress as much as possible. A lot of that is mentality, and so there's a large portion of the section of the book that's all about how to reframe your mind, how to reframe how you're responding to things. I had not long ago an experience where I was taken off out of Tucson on an airplane, a commercial airliner, and we have mountains on all four sides of us, so sometimes the ride's kind of bumpy getting out of there. So we were taking off, and we're a steep angle, because the fellow wanted to clear the mountains, and we hit some air pockets. So there's this great thing. It's like you're being on a ride at an amusement park, and the plane was going boom, 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 and I was loving it. And I said, can you believe this? Because it was one of my best days. I couldn't believe we were getting such a nice bump. And the woman next to me said, no. Well, I was having a great time, and she was having a horrible time, and we were both having the same experience. See? So what I'm saying is, a lot of stress that people have in their mind has to do with things they've created in here. The drive to work can be either stressful or not stressful. You can be listening to classical music, learning things on a talking book, enjoying whatever, or you can be yelling at the driver ahead of you and waiting till you can change lanes and get. You can make your own hell, your own heaven a lot, and your body's going to respond to it. Your hypothalamus is going to respond to how you think and you anticipate as much as it is for an actual event. So one of the first things we can do to help our stress levels is to see if something's really worth stressing about. When I was in chiropractic college, I was riding the bus back and forth to Toronto on the streetcar, and I met this old woman who was lifting these groceries, so I helped her lift her groceries onto the trolley, and we sat there for a while, and I said, she's 94, this is my chance. I got a chance. How does she live to be so long? Oh, so old. I said, so, do you eat anything special? And she goes, lots of cabbage, lots of pork. Oh, great, the two hardest things to digest, the vegetable kingdom and the animal kingdom. Okay. So anything else? He goes, I never worry. I never worry. My husband died, I didn't even go to the funeral. So a lot of what stresses you may not have to be stressful. So think about that. And like I say, there's some techniques in the book that will help you deal with that. So what do we have? Well, we have on one side metabolic syndrome, high cortisol, adrenal fatigue, low cortisol. On the metabolic syndrome side, we have high aldosterone, high sodium, low potassium, high blood sugar, because cortisol, one of its main things it does is elevate blood sugar. It goes into the cells and it causes something called gluconeogenesis. And in other words, it takes fatty acids and proteins, little peptides, and converts them into blood sugar, in the liver and the muscles especially. And so when you have stress, in nature, you're ready to have to do something. You're having to think your way out of this, you're having to act, you're either going to have to fight or run away, you're going to have to do something. So to preparing for that, cortisol goes up, starts getting your blood sugar up, insulin's going to go up because it's got to get, cortisol is going to get the blood sugar up, but it doesn't get it to the cells. Insulin's going to act like the key to get it into your cells, and we want a certain amount of insulin because we don't want too much, because we want enough glucose to feed your brain because it's its favorite food, and we want enough to get the muscles in there and things going. So it's a very delicate thing. Cortisol, insulin, they all work together to help you with the stress. When you have adrenal fatigue, you have low cortisol, so you can't make enough blood sugar. You have hypoglycemia is one of the most common things that happens. You have low aldosterone, so you have a craving for salt and you're craving for water. Low sodium, high potassium, low blood sugar, a mild type of dehydration. Whereas over the other side, we have fluid retention. You see how beautiful it is? Nature's just so wonderful. So there are four definitions. We're going to concentrate on metabolic syndrome in this presentation. So there's four definitions of current definitions of metabolic syndrome. And here are the people who have the organizations have the four different definitions. But they all include glucose intolerance, another blood sugar getting out of control, the pre-diabetic that moves on to diabetic syndrome, or something called dysglycemia, where the blood sugar may run up and then it may go down and then runs up and then goes down. We have some sort of visceral obesity. In other words, the adiposity starts to develop around the adrenal, around the belly. We have a hypertension, high blood pressure. We have what's called dyslipidemia, which means your cholesterol and triglycerides are out of function. You have not enough HDL, too much LDL, and too much triglycerides. There's inflammation going on in your veins, in your arteries, in your brain, in other parts of your body. There's small leakage of protein into the urine called microalbuminuria in the later parts of it. And then it also starts to have a mild effect and then moderate and then a severe effect on different cardiac functions. So metabolic syndrome doesn't happen overnight. It takes years of dedication to get metabolic syndrome. And we start out, actually now we're getting to be to a point where our children are an epidemic proportion of developing metabolic syndrome. insulin resistance can develop in childhood. Now we know that about half to 2/3 of our children are already overweight, and most children show some sort of, more than half of the children show at least one of the indications of metabolic syndrome. But why wouldn't they? What do our schools teach them? Pizza and jujubes are good for you because we serve it in our cafeteria every day.
High fructose corn syrup.
High fructose corn syrup, exactly. We want to make sure we have a dessert with every meal. You know, you go in there and their school's cafeteria looks like a bulletin board, a YouTube advertisement for diabetes and heart disease. So we're teaching our children by the authority of the school to have the diseases that are going to break our healthcare system. Someone's got to make money somewhere, I guess. The reason they made ketchup a vegetable in our school system way back when is because without it, 2/3 of the schools wouldn't qualify for federal existence because they didn't have enough vegetables in the school cafeteria diets. So they made ketchup into a vegetable so they would qualify. So we have here the insulin of both an obese person and a normal person. And you see the one on the top is a person who's overweight, more than 20% body mass. And we see that a normal person, or more of an ideal person, has a much lower insulin level throughout the day. So let's look at this, how this leads to diabetes, because that actually ends up being the endpoint. Well, I'd say one of the median points of metabolic syndrome. We have glucose intolerance, and then as the glucose goes up and down, it has to have somewhere to go. And so a natural response is, first of all, high glucose is a stress for the body, so high glucose by itself will stimulate cortisol production. And then you have gluconeogenesis that happens with glucose, and so you get even higher, and then so that causes insulin. Now, if you have a big onset of this all at once, like taking a 44-ounce or big gulp, or having a second dessert or something like that, that's going to cause the body to go, whoa, we really better get some insulin in here because we've got way too much of the carbohydrate that's going to be digested and floating into the bloodstream. So way too much insulin gets secreted. And so then that causes the blood sugar to start dropping too fast. And that causes a craving for more, so you get into a kind of a cycle. So people feel like they have the accelerator and the brake on at the same time, which they do with the escalating, with these sugars are going up and down. So with time, though, then the body develops some resistance so that it takes more and more insulin inside to turn that key into the cell. And the reason for that is because not only cortisol is elevated, but insulin is damaging to cells. So you don't want the body to have too much insulin. You want enough to open up that key to get the blood sugar in, but you don't want enough to let too much in because the cells inside the mechanisms inside the wheel of the cells start coming off. If you get too much blood sugar inside the cells, then you glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, they go crazy and things overfunction. So insulin is very important to keep constant. It can damage cells if it's too high. Cortisol comes in and helps protect that, but cortisol helps stimulate more insulin, so you get into a positive feedback cycle. Not only that, recent research has come in to say that insulin inside the cell will prevent cortisol from going from the active cortisol to the inactive cortisone, so you get even more of a positive feedback cycle of cortisol not being able to be reduced inside the cell because of the action of insulin on it. So you get into this wheel, perpetual wheel that gets worse and worse the more you spin the wheel. So the early signs of diabetes are really the glucose intolerance. So when you fast, that means don't eat anything from 6 o'clock that night, and then next morning you take a blood glucose, then it's going to be over 99, then that's considered to be glucose intolerance or too high glucose. You get into insulin resistance because we get the fasting insulin that gets higher and higher and higher, and that is what we call syndrome X or metabolic syndrome. Now the consequences of metabolic syndrome are diabetes, and that progresses to cardiovascular disease, and then also we get hormonal irregularities. The adipose tissue itself starts to create its own estrogen. It starts to inhibit its own cortisol reduction. You get decreased DHEAS, that should have an S in there. The DHEAS that becomes DHEA inside the cells, another hormone secreted by the adrenal glands that has a lot to do with sex hormones and other metabolic functions in the body. You get blocked inactivation of the cortisol we were just talking about, which leads to the adipose tissue excess production of cortisol. And one of the other things we find that happens a lot with metabolic syndrome is the polycystic ovarian syndrome, called PCOS. So you can see that this is starting to be a cycle that's not just about stress, it's about the effects of stress, it's about people eating the wrong foods that feeds the stress to make it worse and worse and worse. And so we can easily see then how stress leads to weight gain. Because as the cortisol increases and the insulin is going to increase, then we're going to get more gluconeogenesis. That's going to increase the blood glucose. We're going to have an increased insulin secretion to handle that increased blood glucose. Then that increased insulin over time is going to create an insulin resistance. That in itself is a stressor, and the cortisol has to get elevated in order to balance the excess insulin. And then that's going to help that abdominal fat distribution, because cortisol has, the tissue around here has special sensitivity to cortisol. And so we get this kind of spare tire. So if the amount of available glucose is insufficient, then hunger rises, which happens. And so you get too much insulin, too much cortisol, and then the insulin eventually wins, and then it produces hunger. And the people then don't like to feel hungry, so they tend to overeat, and they usually eat the wrong foods. And that wrong foods that causes a big rush of insulin because they just ate sugary stuff or white flour stuff that's easily converted into sugar, and they start creating their own perpetual problem. So even before diabetes develops, people with insulin resistance and no other risk factor for heart disease develop abnormalities in the blood vessels. And we're seeing these now. When I first practiced, I could look in the eye of a child, teenager, and I'd never see what we call copper cord arteries, where we get atherosclerosis. Now it's common. It's probably every third or fourth child, teenager, you see it. And how do you find it? Well, if you want to spend $200, you can do it yourself. You just have an ophthalmoscope, and you learn to look in the eye, and you can see in the back of the eye, you can see the arteries in the eye, and you'll see that most of the arteries have a deep red or a lighter red look to them, but the ones that are already starting to sclerose will have a shiny copper look to them, and you can find them on there in these young teenagers already. Used to be, see those mainly in the 70-year-olds and older 60-year-olds, but you see them in teenagers now. Another quote: "The major clinical consequence of metabolic syndrome is atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease." And we're teaching our kids to have it from the time they're in grade school. Now, we've been talking about the academics and the physiology and the biochemistry. Let's get down to brass tacks and how you can tell if you have metabolic syndrome yourself. First of all, you're going to need some really fancy tools. A cloth tape measure. Joanne Fabrics, I think Walmart has them. Hancock's Fabrics. Anywhere where they sell a cloth by the roll will have a cloth tape. And you don't have to have a cloth tape, it's just easier. You need scales so you can weigh yourself. You're going to have, you need a blood pressure cuff called a sphygmomanometer. You can get those at drugstores or at medical supplies, or order them on the internet. You need some sort of glucose monitoring device, and I just saw one in Walmart. It was $40 for the machine, and they got a $40 rebate. And the reason for that is because they make the money on the strips. So you get a it costs you nothing, and then you buy the strips, and the strips are about $17 for 100 or something like that. So you prick your finger, cheaper than that? No good. Prick your finger, put a drop of blood on it, put it in the dextrometer or the glucose monitor or the blood sugar monitoring machine, and you'll be able to see in a minute whether or not you have high blood sugar or not. The nice thing is you can also measure this throughout the day. You can measure it after you eat, see how fast it rises, and measure it every 2 hours, every 3 hours. You can do whatever you want. Fingers get a little sore if you do it too much, but that's okay. You can just keep going as long as you want to. I also suggest that you complete an activity and dietary information sheet. I don't have it with me. It's basically what you eat and drink and how you felt and what signs and symptoms you had during the entire day. It's really meant for people that are going to take this elevated cortisol test, where you spit in the tube 4 times a day. But you can get a lot of information about yourself just recording everything you eat and drink and how you felt during the entire day as you're taking the blood sugar several times a day. And here's the key. When you're feeling normal, take your blood sugar 3 or 4 times. When you haven't eaten in the morning, take your blood sugar. That'll give your fasting blood sugar. The other will give your more normal blood sugar. And then when you start feeling symptoms, when you have symptoms, like I don't feel very good or I get pretty hyper, take your blood sugar again and see how much blood sugar is playing a part in what your symptoms are, how you're experiencing it. So here's an observation you can make. Does your stomach precede you? Do you have an apple-type body? Do you have your own personal spare tire? These are 3 ways you can tell that you don't have to even need those others. You have insulin resistance, you have a form of metabolic syndrome. You can do the test and find out how severe it is, and certainly you can monitor your progress by taking those measurements. But that's number 1. If you see this, if you're overweight, especially around the tummy area, you have some sort of metabolic syndrome. Symptoms, fatigue. Now, the interesting thing about cortisol is when cortisol, you remember I said you start getting symptoms about 15 to 20% outside that median, about a half a standard deviation. Well, the interesting thing is when you have mildly elevated cortisol or mildly low cortisol, you have some of the same symptoms. You have the same thing with low and high thyroid. You get someone moderately low or moderately high. A lot of times they'll have same or similar symptoms. And you can have brain fogginess and inability to focus, which you can get with high or low cortisol. But unique to the metabolic syndrome is an intestinal bloating, a gas. And the reason for this is because you're also exhausting the exocrine portion of the pancreas as well as the endocrine portion of the pancreas. So the endocrine portion of the pancreas is split into 2 pieces. We've got the beta cells producing insulin, and then we have the alpha cells producing something called amylase. And amylase is the digestive fluid that helps you digest carbohydrates. And so as it gets weaker, you can't digest the carbohydrates as well. So the stress has caused a depletion of the amount of amylase secreted by the pancreas. And so that's why you can't digest the carbohydrates very well. So if you want to do a little test with yourself, eat a plate of spaghetti and don't put anything on it, no butter, no salt, no meatballs or anything, and see how you feel for the next 60 minutes. If you don't feel sleepy or you don't feel like anything is happening, you're probably okay as far as your amylase goes. But if you feel sleepy and you feel like you got a lead ball in here and you don't want to talk, you find you can't think very well after that spaghetti meal, you probably have a lack of amylase. You need digestive aids. Go to the health food store and get some digestive aids to help you digest those carbohydrates. And a mild form of depression that's independent of depressive events. In other words, nothing's really happening that makes you feel depressed, but you feel depressed anyway. So how are you going to measure? You can take your waist measurement in addition. So we do it with the scales. We can see what your weight is, and we're going to do your waist measurement, and that's to gently go around where your belly button is, and then your hip measurement, the widest part of your buttocks here, and take those measurements, write them down, and then you can do what they call a waist-hip ratio. And there's no reason to just say males in there, that's males and females. And you can also do something called a body mass index. So you can take your weight, you can take your height, and you can find out something called a body mass index. So if you simply do your visceral obesity test with a waist circumference, if you're a male, you have more latitude, you get to have a waist of over 40. Anything over 40 is considered to be abnormal. If you're a female, any waist over 35 is considered to be abnormal. See, women just don't get a break, do they? You have the waist-hip ratio. It's okay with men if you divide the amount of inches in your waist, divide that by your hips, and you get the hip-waist ratio. If it comes out to be 0.9 or less, then it's okay. But if you have 0.85 as a female or less, then you're okay. So greater than 0.9 in a male, greater than 0.85 in a female means that you have an elevated hip-waist ratio. Now, why would we want to measure the hip weight ratio? Did I cut off the BMI? Okay, it's down here. Because when you do these, both of them are valuable. So if we do just a visceral adiposity, just the waist measurement, then that's an important indicator, and especially if you look at your triglycerides, a simple blood test your doctor can give you. I'll even give you the Quest number in just a little bit. Then if you have an elevated waist circumference and high triglycerides, that's a stronger indicator than either one by themselves. And it ends up that a waist circumference is actually a better predictor of metabolic syndrome and cardiovascular risk and mortality than the BMI. But they're both valuable. So to do the body mass index, you simply take your weight with that scale you bought, you measure a height, and you convert the weight and the height into kilograms and meters. And how you do that is a kilo is 2.2 pounds, you probably already know this, and 1 meter is 39.37 inches. So you divide your weight by 2.2 and you divide your height by 39.37. That gives you your weight and height in the metric. And so if when you divide your weight by then you also have to square your height. So and if you don't know how to do it, if you go to calculator and say that your height is 2 meters, then it's 2 meters. If you on a calculator, if you just hit times equal, it'll automatically square it for you. Or you can do 2 meters times 2 meters, so you'd have 4 meters. So you'd have your results squared, and so you'd have your height by your height squared divided into your weight, and that's going to give you your body mass index. If you're over 25, then you're considered to be overweight. If you're over 25 but under 30. If you're over 30, then you're considered to be obese or grossly overweight. And if you're Asian, though, no matter what it is, if you're over 21, we can't go by the same indicators if you're Asian, of Asian descent. If you have a body mass index of over 21, then you're considered to be having metabolic syndrome. Now, metabolic syndrome, BMI, is a good indication of metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance. And visceral obesity is associated with increased cardiovascular risk, but not actual heart disease. But BMI, when it's increased, is a risk of unstable angina and myocardial infarct. In other words, if your heart disease if you have an increased BMI, you have an increase for heart disease of an unstable angina and a myocardial infarct, which is a medical term for heart attack. And it's progressive. In other words, the higher BMI, the more likely you are to have unstable angina and a myocardial infarct, such as if you're well within the normal range of 22, then you have no risk at all for either one of these. But as it gets up, by the time you get to a BMI of 40, you've got almost a 4.5 times likelihood of having unstable angina and myocardial infarct. And remember, men, that first sign of cardiovascular disease in half the males is sudden death. It's the first sign. Most men are unaware. So in other words, what we're saying is first heart attack, half of them don't make it to the hospital. And of that, there's the ones that do make it to the hospital, a lot of those don't make it through the first night. And I have some studies I'm not going to bring in here tonight, but I can tell you that the adrenals are one of the deciding factors on whether someone makes it through that first night. The strength of the adrenals have a lot to do with survival of a heart attack, of a first heart attack or following heart attack. So the higher the BMI, the greater the proportional risk of all-cause mortality, not just heart attack, but all-cause mortality, and lots of other kinds of things, including sudden death, thrombosis, diabetes, hypertension, and generally poor health. All people with excess abdominal fat have some degree of insulin resistance, as we said before. It's now known to be associated with inter-abdominal fat as opposed to total fat distribution. In other words, there's some people that are fat all over. They're not as much risk as the people that are just fat around the middle. So we can diagnose our own. We know that you have resting blood pressure. What your blood pressure is when you rest. By the way, blood pressure is almost you can't depend on what your doctor says what your blood pressure is. Because there's something called white coat syndrome. When you go in his office, your blood pressure automatically elevates. And so your best indication is to have your own spig at home, the sphygmomanometer, and they have self-inflating ones. They have ones that will have a printed readout. There's all kinds of fancy inflating things you can get. They run from about $14 to $140. And you take your blood pressure, and you want the high part when if you're listening, you listen to when you can hear the heartbeat, when you first can hear it, as you let the spig out, and you write down that number. You see a little gauge, and then when you hear it go away, you write down that number. And one's called the diastolic is the low number, and the systolic is the high number, and that's your blood pressure. So it's when the sound comes, you pump it up to where it cuts off all blood supply, and then you let it out little by little, listen to it. And when you first hear the sound, you write down that number on the gauge. When you can't hear it anymore, you write it down, and that's your blood pressure, 90 over 120 over 80 or whatever it is. So you thought it took a lot of training to do this. No, it takes about 2 minutes to teach someone how to take blood pressure. So how do you know if you have what's called hypertension or high blood pressure? Well, if you consistently, and I don't mean one time, but if you consistently get a blood pressure that's 140 over 90 or greater, either one of those numbers are greater, then you have something as a single marker. But if you have some of these other indicators of metabolic syndrome, the overweightness, the high glucose, then if you have a BP of greater than 130 over 80, now notice 80 is considered to be normal in medical literature, but if you have this of 130 over 80 or greater, then you're considered to be having a marker of hypertension when it comes to metabolic syndrome. Note that insulin resistance precedes hypertension by about 10 to 20 years. So you got somebody that's going to have insulin resistance. It's going to take them a while before they develop their hypertension. So if you are taking your blood pressure and you go, oh, I got high blood pressure, you've had insulin resistance for at least 10 years, probably, most likely. You can do this simply with the insulin meter we were talking about. You can also test urinary overflow of glucose. So you can get little pee strips from Johnson & Johnson, and so they're just urinary strips. They're easy to take, and they can have just glucose indicators. You can get 8 different markers on one little strip, and you just dip them in your pee midstream, or you can put it in a cup and test them. It's easiest to do it midstream. You wait a minute, you check on the little the bottle you get it on has the interpretation right there. It's all colorimetric determination, so it turns colors. Each one of these little blocks on this strip will tell you whether your ketones are elevated, your blood, whether you have blood in your urine, whether you have protein in your urine. It's very easy to do. It's what your doctor charges $27 to do. It costs you about $1 for you to do it at home. Go into a medical supply house. You're looking for urinary strips, and you can get just a glucose, or you can get up to 8 different strips.
That keto stick?
Yeah, you can do keto. Keto sticks is one of the specialties. So you can get on that one that does 8. Ketones are included in that. Yeah, so those are ketone strips, glucose strips, protein strips, but then you can get one that has them all if you want to. You do your fasting blood glucose. Remember you had the $40 meter, you got a $40 refund in? Okay, so you're fasting glucose, you wake up, you take it, and if it's over 99, you're in problems. If it's over 110, you're a flat diabetic. And this isn't just one day. Take it 3 or 4 days, and if it's consistently elevated, you've got your problems. You can do fasting insulin. Most of these modern meters do have fasting insulin too, and if that happens, if you're over 108 picomoles per liter, then you're going to have insulin resistance along with the blood dyscrasia, the blood glucose dyscrasia. You can also take after you eat. It's called postprandial. After you eat, your blood sugar normally rises, but if you wait about 30 minutes and take your blood sugar and it's more than 140, then you have some sort of what we call glucose dyscrasia, blood dyscrasia. The glucose is out of line. Not necessarily related to insulin, by the way. There's a large argument going on in medicine about that. Normally you don't have any glucose in your urine, so normally those glucose sticks should be 0. After you eat, however, there's some spillover, so you may get a 1+. They're usually 1+, 2+, 3+, 4+, and you get 1+. That's all you need. If you get more than 1+, you got problems. Your kidneys are spilling over glucose. You can also do the salivary test kit. You can get these online. There's about a dozen labs that do it. I think my preference of labs is DRT labs at salivatest.com, because I know the people that run that lab. I know people that run a lot of labs, but this one I see the care they go through to make sure everything is accurate.
Livetest.com, you say?
Oh, it's called salivatest.com. Yes, or you can Google ZRT labs. And I suggest if you're going to take your cortisol, you take them 4 times during the day. And they'll give you instructions. You ask for the 4 times cortisol test, and you test the one at 8 o'clock in the morning, at noon, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 11 o'clock at night. The instructions will be in the test. And then we're looking for elevated or depressed cortisol levels, or sometimes they're very up and down. So there's some laboratory tests you can ask your doctor to order for you. And here's the Quest Kin panel I think you get the most bang for your buck out from. It's called the Kin panel 11 plus HDL. And the test code on that is 900151. And pedestrian cost, in other words, walking in off the street, not getting any kind of discount the physicians get, that's cost $78.22 last time I checked, about 6 months ago. Now your doc may want to charge $122 or whatever, but you say, hey doc, it doesn't cost you that much. Actually, it costs him probably between, depending on how many lab tests he orders, between 35 and 55 for the same test. You shouldn't pay more than this much when he charges you.
In California, there is illegal for the doctor.
Is it illegal? Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. I'm good. Okay. Same as I don't like carpenters overcharging me for what they buy at Home Depot. I don't like the doctor overcharging for the laboratory test he runs. And what you'll get, bang for your buck, you're going to get fasting glucose, blood urea, nitrogen.